Mr Speaker, I stand to speak to the Sentencing Aggravating Factors Amendment Bill, and Mr Speaker, I say Labor does support this bill to committee stages. We do agree, despite what a former National Party Speaker said earlier in this debate, we do agree that assaults on police and prison officers should be taken very seriously, and we have no problem with supporting this bill. However, Mr Speaker, we are concerned that it won't really make any difference, as the courts already can and usually do take consideration of this as an aggravating factor in sentencing. And I have to say that it's interesting that the government are taking this issue so seriously with regards to the safety of prison officers and police officers, when, with respect to some of the legislation that's been passed and with some of the changes that the Minister of Corrections has made, we have to question whether or not she has taken it seriously in the past. Mr Speaker, I was a member of the Law and Order Select Committee about 6 months ago, and there were a few things that came to that Select Committee that really did put at risk the safety of the prison guards. Now, let me just mention one thing to start with. Firstly, the double bunking that Minister of Corrections thought she'd introduce. Double bunking which had evidence against it, suggesting that it would actually jeopardise the safety of the prison guards. Mr Speaker, we've seen the privatisation of our of prisons legislation go through, and we had submissions at that time on that suggestion, saying that in the past, when we had a private prison in New Zealand, that it actually was a safety risk to the prison officers that were in there at the time. They stated that because of the performance bonus environment that they were working in, that unfortunately a lot of what should have been reported wasn't reported, and then their safety was directly at risk, Mr Speaker. So here we are tonight discussing the Sentencing Aggravating Factors Amendment Bill and discussing the fact, well, that side of the House is discussing the fact that it's all about the safety of prison guards, but Mr Speaker, we've had very clear legislation go through this House which actually puts that safety at risk. So, Mr Speaker, as I said, we support it. We support the safety of our police officers. We, along with every other member of Parliament in this House, are appalled at the statistics with regards to the increase in assaults that have occurred for police officers over the last 5 years, that have occurred for prison officers over the last 5 years. But the reality is, Mr Speaker, that although we support this legislation because it does no harm, it actually won't do any good either. And the unfortunate reality is that in 2 years' time, when we look back and we look at the statistics from now and 2 years moving forward, there will be no change in the actual assault cases that are occurring, and unfortunately what we'll probably see is a continued steady incline with regards to those actual assault cases that take place. Mr Speaker, when we talk about police officers and prison guards and we talk about them as victims of assault, we take that very seriously. We take it very seriously when we're talking about victims of any crime. And what we are disappointed about on this side of the House is that the national government seems to pick and choose when victims' rights and when victims' safety is of importance. Mr Speaker, we have seen in recent weeks just a real undermining of the safety of everyday New Zealanders, with the cuts to family violence programs, and that is not going to do any good, Mr Speaker, for those women that are in situations where they are victims of domestic violence. What we're going to see there is resourcing, funding taken away, so that no longer will they have the support that they need if they find themselves in that situation. Now that is a clear indication that the national government are not looking after victims. Another case where they're not looking after victims is with regards to the domestic violence bill, which is languishing at the bottom of the order paper, which was consulted on with the sector widely, which had much time and resource invested in it, and yet that side of the House doesn't take it seriously to move it up the paper quickly. And yet I think in their first 100 days of office when they got in there, the things that they prioritised at that time were from memory. They weren't even that important. Attacking workers' rights. What else did they do in their first 100 days? Tax cuts for the rich. I think in their first 100 days they gave $30 million to private schools. A whole lot of things that aren't priority, and yet it's another example of where the national government didn't prioritise victims. They didn't prioritise the domestic violence bill. Instead, what we saw was attacks on workers' rights. So here we have a piece of legislation that the government is purporting is an indication of their support for the safety of police officers and prison guards, and yet, as I said, every other victim has been hung out to dry by the national government, and the reality is, and I say this sadly because we wish that it would help, but the reality is that it's not going to make a difference at all. Now, we do not have any objection to this bill, as I said, but our real concern is that it won't make a difference. The Sentencing Act already provides that the court may take into account any aggravating or mitigating factor that it thinks fit in addition to the specific factors listed in Section 9 of the Act. And that is something that's already happening. So in terms of aggravating factors, in terms of looking at that when sentencing takes place, we don't need the legislation to make that happen. It is something that's already happening in our courts. The proposed amendment will not require the court to take any specific action in terms of the type or severity of sentence imposed. The court will simply be required to take this factor into account along with other specified and unspecified aggravating factors and arriving at the appropriate sentence to be imposed in a particular case. In most circumstances, the process, considerations and conclusion that the courts come to will not be in the slightest bit affected by this proposed amendment, because the fact that an offence has been committed against a police or prison officer is something that the court would usually already, as I said before, take into consideration. The Ministry of Justice pointed out in the RIS to this bill that courts have traditionally regarded assaults on law enforcement officers as serious. The High Court has described an attack on a police officer as equivalent to an attack on the community because our police are the representatives of the community in the matter of law and order in the society. They are society's front line. The Court of Appeal has emphasised the gravity of using serious violence against police officers and upheld deterrent sentences in a number of cases. This certainly won't have any effect on the likelihood that an offender will assault a police or prison officer either. Offenders do not stop to consider mitigating and aggravating factors that may be taken into consideration by a court when committing an offence. And it's another example of the national government doing things like this in a punitive manner where it doesn't make a difference. We saw it with the Three Strikes Bill. We know from the submissions that came before the Select Committee that having three strikes legislation is not going to make an offender stop and think before they commit the crime. So basically, not effective at all. This is another meaningless piece of law and order legislation from a government which does not seem to have any ideas for reducing crime other than increasing sentences. And in terms of what's going on at the moment out there with people struggling because the cost of living is going up, with the government proposing state asset sales, despite the fact that 60% of New Zealanders say they don't want it and only 10% say that they do want it, with the fact that our schools are increasingly seeing children show up without having had breakfast and without lunch in their bags, it does make us on this side of the House wonder why legislation like this, which we know will not be effective, should be of priority for the national government. And it really is about window dressing. It really is about the national government trying to look like they are being hard on crime, trying to look like they are doing something with regards to law and order. But at the end of the day, we know on this side of the House, and time will tell, that none of these measures that they're putting into place will be effective in any way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that I'm rather disappointed in the previous speaker. First of all, she actually said that, that this legislation will do nothing for the crime levels. And I guess then she actually sort of tried to say that the courts are already dealing with it, saying that it is already a mitigating factor. Sir, there is a huge difference in when something is maybe considered in one hand or being required to be